Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second show. For the audience, I'm at this moment in Taiwan, and to be able to finish the production of the second episode, I'm now traveling in a city called Shishang on the east side of Taiwan, which is a very popular place for rice production and rice field. So I want to share my window view with you for a minute. Yeah, maybe I should do the whole show like this so you have a better view through the episode, but let me put it back to myself. So the second episode is a discussion and conversation with Ernst Bovelander. Ernst Bovelander was the CEO of Brightsight, and for a long time, my direct boss in Brightsight. And he has a lot of influence on the direction of Brightsight and also on my career. And it was really an honor to talk with him. And we went back from the beginning of his career in the department in TNO, which actually became the Brightsight that we know of, and until his second coming to Brightsight. So when I joined Brightsight, it was a company with less than 30 people. And when Ernst came back to Brightsight, they were around 60, 70 people. And we are going through, I would say, a renaissance of Brightsight. We were growing very fast. The business went well. And Ernst came back with two goals from the previous owners. And that is to grow Brightsight, to make it more professional, and also to grow it so that it's ready for a sale. And I think in a way, if we look at pure these two goals, he was really successful in that. But I think in the process of becoming so-called quote unquote professional, a lot of things changed in the company. I put my thoughts about what is a professional lab in the blog that I wrote this time. So again, if you don't know, to really enjoy or really go on the journey with me in the podcast, there's a blog that I put the link underneath in the in description that you can follow, and I'll put more in-depth thoughts about the discussion that I have during the podcast in the blog. So if you read the blog and watch the podcast, it will help you or also to have a even better conversation or discussion with me or to more understanding about the industry. So I hope you will enjoy this episode and this conversation. Just a few things about the comments that I got from the first period. Thanks for first of all, thanks for all of you for listening. And second of all, I think the most people had comment on the length of the episode. And spoiler alert, this one is even longer than the last one. And I think the next one is even longer because I've already finished recording of the third and the fourth episodes here in Taiwan. I think on one side, I want to keep the conversation in one go so that you have the full conversation in once and not waiting for it. Second is that I really want to support this long content format instead of the quick swiping culture that is now so popular. And I think it's good to train your patience. And if you really think it's too long, I think in YouTube, Apple, or Spotify, you can all increase your playing speed. Sometimes I do that for the conversation or for the podcast I listen to. And also, this podcast is not updated so frequently, so just feel free to listen to it every day for 10 minutes, and then you will be finished before the next episode is coming out. For the rest, do let me know what you think about the episodes, and again, welcome to the conversation. Of course, big thank you still for Narashima for the logo, and as you can see, I try to print it on a T-shirt. If anyone is interested in that, maybe I'll do some merchandise in the future. But this is just for fun, for myself. And also, I want to thank Shichi again for the music. I still need to learn how to put text on the video, so I'll just speak it, which is more easy. Also want to thank Brightsight for borrowing us the place to record this episode. Again, the episodes are far from perfect. As you can see, the camera angle but this time the sound is better, but sometimes the camera angles still are not so perfect. And the reason why it takes so long time to do the episode is because I need to do the edit first, and then I will get the consent and the content reviewed by the people I interviewed with, and also then I need to make the subtitle. Of course, I let AI do it, but because of our industry has some special words, and English is not the first language of a lot of my guests. So it takes some time to correct the subtitle. So at least the English and the Chinese subtitles are checked by me. They are not literal translation, which I think is done quite well by AI to give the context more than the literal translation. And I generate the other languages by using AI. So if you see something that is wrong, do let me know, and maybe we can correct it. But most of them are just to help you to understand the content of the episodes more easily. Especially on YouTube, you can find a lot of different subtitles. Please use it. Finally, for the listeners based in China, the episodes are now also on Bilibili and also Little Red Book. I hope that is easier for you to listen to or watch the podcast. Maybe I'll still find the pure audio format for the podcast, or pure audio podcast format platform in China for the audio podcasts. But at this moment, feel free to enjoy it on Bilibili and the Little Red Book. And again, if you like the content, please subscribe. And this podcast is all about the journey and also the history of high assurance security evaluation and certifications. And we'll talk about this topic from all different sides, from the evaluation side, or the lab side, or the certification body side, and from developer side. And I will interview all the different people that I admire or learn to know during my 20-year journey in this industry. So hope you like it, and keep watching. Hi, Ernst.
Hi, Kai-Fong.
Thank you very much for being here and be my second guest, second interview. Last time I didn't prepare it well, so my belly was really big and all the things. But I hope this time it's better. And special thanks to Brightsight to borrow us this meeting room. We're back to our home, and hope to have a nice conversation with you, because you have been quite important not only for this industry, but I think for me personally to become more professional and get into management and all the things. We learned a lot, but of course, we want to know more about the story when you came into or came back to. We'll touch on that to Brightsight and your adventure in the security-related world so far. For people who don't know, Ernst has been the CEO of Brightsight for how many years?
I think in total about 8 years.
8 years, and then retired last year.
Yes.
So why don't we start with the very beginning, because it's very interesting for me. When I knew you, you came back to Brightsight, but later when we talked more, I know you were in Brightsight, or the previous life incarnation of Brightsight before, when it was still a small department in T&O, and you probably was the second person who joined the team. So can you tell us, like from the start, when how did you get into this?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you first of all for the invite. It's a pleasure talking with you. It's also interesting to come back to the old nest at Brightsight. So it feels a bit like coming home, although we both now left the company. I a bit longer, but still, it feels like a warm place to come into, and that's always interesting to see how that works. Yeah, going back, I was born and raised in Delft. I went to school, went to university in Delft, and so my whole social life was in Delft. And I studied here at the Technical University, industrial design engineering, nothing to do with security, nothing even
for the
remotely
girl
related to that.
For the girls, right? So.
No, not really. Trust me, at that point in that time in life, the female population in Delft student was extremely limited. Yeah. Fortunately, that has changed tremendously. If you look today at the university, it's I don't know the percentages, but it's way more than it ever was when I was studying. But that was not the point. I really enjoyed working and living in Delft and staying in Delft. So for that reason, and the industrial design engineering felt really good because it was practical, but not so technical as the other studies, and especially the part where we studied the more managerial stuff, like marketing, like how do you run a business, etc. That I found very interesting, especially the product development part, how you manage the product development part. That was for me a very interesting part of the studies. So after my studies, I needed to find a job. At that point in time, it was not so easy to find jobs. We're talking about late 1980s, and well, it was difficult. It was difficult to find something proper. And I had a friend, Gerard van Batten, who's also an employee of today of Brightsight, was then working at T&O. And so we catch up and we say, okay, how are you doing? What is your life? Blah, blah. You know how things are going. You're in the pub and you say, well, I'm just finished my university. I'm looking for a job. I said, why don't you come and work at T&O where I work? Yeah. So what do you do? Yeah, we are in a very small team and we are working on information security. We are evaluating products for security. So that sounds interesting. I was looking for a job. I had no idea what I was talking about. I went on the interview. The interview went really well, and I joined the team. And it was a very small team, as you say. There are, I think, from the top of my head, 5 people or so in that team. And the team was not very focused on information security, although we're doing a bit here and a bit there. You know how it was. At least I didn't see the focus. It could also be my problem there. So the team was say a couple of people, 5 people, and the prime part of that team was the prime focus of that team was evaluating of payment terminals. So there were two organizations around that. Brings back old memories, Bayanet and the ZKA, the Zentrale Kreditausschuss, the German. So we were evaluating payment terminals for these markets. Interesting was that the requirements were not so strong, it was not so strict in that sense, so it was not very well formulated. It was just, we got the product and you could see if you could break it in, and then what we made is a report to say yes, we could break it in or we couldn't, but we needed this effort and this expertise to get in. And with that assessment we handed over the report to these organizations and they decided whether the terminal would go to the market or not. So that was the team we were doing. Also doing a bit of cryptography here. We had a cryptography expert in that, working on electronic cash with the University of Amsterdam. David Chang was also somewhere related to that. So it's a really a very very early start of that industry. So I was there hired as a security evaluator, and I found out after a year max that I was not pretty good at that. I didn't really have the expertise needed. I missed the electronic background. I missed the technical background, and you could easily say, well, that should have been the end of my career in the security industry because I was not a good security evaluator. At least that's what I thought. But then I figured out and I found out that talking to customers, explaining why they need a security evaluation, looking at the bigger picture of things, talking to the schemes, talking to potential customers, that was really something that I did like. And that was much needed. So I started what I would now call business development. I started a business development path within TNO, focusing on getting new customers in, getting new schemes in, talking to a lot of people, going to conferences, explaining what we were doing, explaining the very little niche, because the niche was even smaller than
you were still in the same team.
We're still in the same team. Yeah, the team supported me greatly for that, because they saw, okay, let's see how we can grow. And as I said, it was only 4 or 5 people. It was a very small team, and only actually 2 customers, two schemes that now and then send a customer to us. Not very commercial in that sense. So we changed that. We started to change that, talking to customers, and as I said, going to conferences, making presentations, and this is how I more or less changed my career from the pure technical stuff, which I understood, but I wasn't really good at it, to a more managerial business development path, which I really enjoyed. And I was, at least from my perspective,
good in it.
Much better in it, much better in it than looking into these devices and drilling holes in that. So that was really the start of that career, and that path took me, we did some very interesting things there, because as I said in the beginning, it was about the BNE there, which was the Dutch banks and a bit of the German banks.
Where did the customer come from? Who do you need to go to?
That was interesting, because we didn't really know that. They were going to Bayonet or to one of the schemes and said, I have this payment terminal, can I get it to the Dutch market? No, you cannot. You have to first go to TNO, have an assessment of your product, and if they find if they write the report, they do the assessment, then we will decide whether it's applicable for the Dutch market or you can use it for the Dutch market. So there was very few direct customers calling us, and it all came through the schemes, and they came to us. And there you also I noted that if a customer is forced to you, and force is a strong word, but they are sent to you by a scheme, you have to go there. Look at this perspective from the customer. They have a finished product, probably already working in another country, and so it could be working in France or in Italy, whatever it is, and then they have to go to the Dutch market, and they have to go to this institute where there are 4 or 5 nerdy people, and yes, we're going to take a drill and drill into this. Well, we're a nuisance. We're just a nuisance, and whatever we find, it's always difficult because but it's okay for that market, and we find it. If we didn't find anything, it was also a nuisance because they had to pay the money, and I could have told you it was good. So that relationship with the customer was really problematic, and with that attitude, I also went to the market and went to the customer saying, "Now we can really help you. We can really help you in getting new developments, having new things coming in because you are innovating. We are following that market. We are trying to help you." And as a result of that, we entered a completely new, different set of customers and schemes. And to give you an example of that, and it's difficult to call names in this industry, but I think some of that is some of these names we can mention. At the time when we were developing this, we were still building on that. The smart card was already somewhere in the world introduced. You had this card in France, the B0 Prime card, developed by Groupement Carte Bancaire. And so they were using that card already for payments and well, basically payments actually.
Yeah.
But the big schemes like Visa, MasterCard in America, and Express, they were still on MagStripe. And they were spending a lot of time and effort to secure the MagStripe, having all sorts of networks and innovations around that to make sure that the payments done on the EMVCo MagStripe were still well, EMVCo didn't really exist. Didn't really exist, but at least the payments were secure, or as secure as they could. And they didn't really consider the smart card because it was too difficult, too niche, too new. But they started thinking about it from a completely different perspective. So, and I vividly remember when we were in San Francisco area visiting Visa to talk about the future and how we could help them, blah, you know how that works. And we said, well, what about the smart card? Are you considering using a smart card to enhance the security of your payments? No, not really, but we are thinking about using the smart card as a sort of marketing device. And they called it the relationship. So building more functionality into the smart card to have a closer bond with their customers. So that was the thinking at that point in time. And of course, history is clear. They started moving to the smart card. We were putting effort and time here in looking at smart card evaluations. So we brought the first probe station. We got microscopes. We had etching machines to open up the smart cards, doing all sorts of innovative stuff and innovative evaluations on smart card, way ahead of the market using it. That kind of development is there. And but opening that door, all of a sudden, I was at the table with Visa. I was at the table at MasterCard, American Express, all other developers.
When did, just to get the timeline a bit straight, when did, there was like EuroPay, right?
Yes.
And when did MasterCard acquire it? A lot of people don't know EMVCo. EMV stands actually EuroPay, MasterCard, Visa.
Yeah.
And then MasterCard acquired EuroPay.
Yes.
When was that happened? When you were still?
I'm pretty bad at timelines, but my perspective, I would say early 90s. And so EuroPay was also there. They were involved in it, but for us, EuroPay was not really a contact. We did everything through MasterCard. So we had this wonderful character, Terry Stanley, who was in MasterCard at that period, and we had a pretty strong relationship with him because he was really pushing the market. He was really pushing the innovations, and that was really interesting to be there. So for us, MasterCard was way more important than EuroPay. Yeah. So that was so that market started developing, and it was really like a sort of snowball, moving very slowly in the beginning, but it also changed the attitude in the lab. So the attitude in the lab was, okay, we have now this, we started from the payment terminals, but now we had this whole new customers, the Visas and the MasterCards and all the companies associated with them. So the developers were there as well. And required new skills, so we hired more people. We hired people that were more focused on these microelectronics rather than just looking at the payment terminal. So that really developed, but also the attitude towards the market changed. Yeah. So that was really the path of growth that we were in TNO. So I think after about a year of 5 after I joined the team, we were roughly at 20 people, and we were really into a new market, entering new customers and doing all new kind of innovative things. And we really were at the forefront of the market. Interesting is that at that point in time, also there was we were not alone, of course. The market was developing, and there were other people and other organizations around that. And you had this illustrious guy in the US, Paul Kocher, and I'm sure everyone in the industry knows his name. He found some very, very clear vulnerabilities in smart card technology, side channel attacks on the power consumption of cars. And by looking at that, he could derive information from it. Yeah. And he also had a magical cure around that, because he also developed his solutions around that. Yeah.
And patented.
Very, very clever, very clear. I think most people in the industry were not really jealous, but they would say, okay, this is smart. Yeah. This is really smart. Why didn't we think of that? And the interesting part is that we were also working on that. We were also working on exactly the same, but we coming from TNO, and it shows a bit of how we were in that. We were more like, oh, this is interesting, let's investigate it and see what we can do and how can we help our customers. We were not like, okay, how can we find a solution, patent it, and get rich from it. The mindset was completely different from at this part of the ocean.
When I joined Brightsight, I think I remember Paul Kocher, inventor of side channel analysis, and created this company called Cryptography Research.
Yes.
And every year they will come to Brightsight, or TNO and Brightsight, just to interact. And I also know Brightsight is the first lab outside of USA who performed the side channel successfully, but probably also because they were already also looking into this type of things.
Yeah, I think there were two major vulnerabilities as we knew it at that point in time in the smart cards. It was timing. So we were looking at timing attacks, and that meaning, so because the time that computations took, you could learn a lot from them, especially on the pin codes, etc. So
sometimes you have to decide, is it pin code right? If you say you see it's wrong,
yes,
then you'll say no.
No, yeah.
And then, but when it's right, you'll take a longer time and say, oh, it's right. And correct. That's the most simple timing attack.
It's most simple, and if you say it like this, it sounds very simple. But if you have to execute it, and that's more difficult. We were on that path. We were very strong on that, and I think we were pretty unique on that. Simultaneously, we had people working on also the power consumption. Mark Witteman, then a colleague of TNO, was extremely strong. After that, he became the founder of RiskCure, and of course, we all know RiskCure about all the tools and etc. They make tools around this. So, but he was really at the foundation also of these side channel attacks, and so we were pretty advanced on that. But you are right, we were the first to actually follow the path of DPA, so differential power analysis, that Paul Kocher had developed and found a solution for that. And of course, the industry was like, okay, what's happening right now? But the good thing was that that really boomed the market, at least for security evaluations, because all of a sudden, smart cards were not the holy grail. They were not the solution to everything. They were just products that had vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities needed to be assessed by labs like TNO at that time. So that really boomed the market, and all of a sudden we had companies from all over the world with smart card products, telecom providers, you name it, coming to companies like TNO to do that. I said companies like TNO, there were not many other ones. There was a lab in Germany. They are today TÜV IT, so they grew from that.
Were they earlier than T-System?
I could be that I'm mixing up here. I don't know this by heart. They were called Davis at that point in time, and I think Davis moved into TÜV IT. I could be wrong here. Okay. So if so, I stand corrected. But for the point,
anyone leave and comment if it's wrong.
It brings back old memories, and we're talking about 30 years ago.
But so that's what my goal, to puzzle up all the pieces.
But we had this group in Germany, Davis, and they were doing similar things, and so they grew with the market. So, and that's good. A market where you are all by yourself, that's not a market. That is interesting, but as soon as you have competition, other labs pop up, then it becomes interesting. Also in France there were some labs doing evaluation. So the industry grew with that, with the awareness of security vulnerability for smart cards, and so that was a very interesting time. Then. That was the industry. Now, my role in this, I was doing business development. I traveled all the world, went to customers here, went to customers there. But also that Paul Kosher approach, he said, well, that's interesting because you can actually make money here. Very commercially, and within TNO, especially at that point in time, TNO was not really commercially driven.
By nature, it's not supposed to make money.
It's a not-for-profit. At that point in time, it was a not-for-profit organization. So making money was not a dirty word. Yes, we were supposed to make money, but being commercial, being there for profit, that was not something that was in the nature or the DNA of TNO. And that started to hinder me, because I had an ambition, I saw things changing in the industry, I saw the opportunities there, and I started discussing together with some people from TNO, and especially Jan Pieters, discussing with management of TNO, said, what about carving us out? What about if we started building up our own legal entity, our own limited organization? Yeah, could be associated to TNO, I don't know, but at least have some freedom and have some differentiation from the standard TNO work, being more commercial. Those discussions went on and on. They were, interesting, but they went on and they didn't really move. And so after three years of discussing with the senior management of TNO, I decided, well, this is not going to work. I don't have the energy for pushing this even further and doing it. So I started looking outside of TNO. And I had a small step 1 year at Bell ID, also doing business development. But I started after that, and that was my idea at the beginning. I started my own consulting group in an organization, and building that consulting group, also all revolving around information security, not so much on the industry of where I was coming from, not on the payment industry, but more governmental, big projects, etc. All smart card related, all PKI related, because that was the foundation and the background. But then after about close to 10 years, I left TNO. And Jan Pieters was still there. There were affiliations.
So TNO said yes after you leave.
Yeah, well, yes, you could phrase it like that. I don't know.
No, but not because of you, but somehow it's also at the certain time they were.
True, but interesting to learn is that after now within TNO there were two groups doing information security. There was a group, our group, doing
TPD.
The TPD, working on the payment industry, etc. And we had this other group within another organization of TNO working more on the defense industry. But interesting, the defense industry and governmental, they were all about common criteria. the group where I was in was not so much about common criteria, because that was not really the standard for products at that point in time. It was coming up, but it was like, we don't know that. Yeah. So it was too distant, too far away. After I left, the two groups started working together. So Dirk-Jan Oud was leading the group within the defense team. Jan Pieters was leading the group here in the TPD thing. So the two teams, they started working together, and they really caught up nicely. Mm. And the seed that was planted, let's do this independently of TNO, was still there. Yeah. So they started discussing with management. So Jan Pieters and Dirk-Jan Oud started to discuss with management, cannot we carve this out of TNO? Mm. I was not there anymore. But I think, and I know, it took at least another 3-4 years to get that done. So it wasn't as immediately after I closed the door it happened, but they had more time, more energy to have that continuous discussion with the senior management of TNO. So then we have the two paths. So you have the path of TNO carving out, and at some point revolving or emerging into Brightsight. So that moved there, and I was on the outside dancing around projects in the Netherlands, where we still had connections all the time, because we were doing projects like the board computer taxi, which is a computer for taxi, measuring the
mileage and
the working hours and etc. Just as an example, I was there working for the ministry as a project manager with the team, and TNO, or Brightsight, was involved on the security evaluation part. And this is not the most successful project, but it's a project that comes to mind. So we were still dancing around, and every year, or at least twice a year, we were just drinking a coffee, how are you doing, etc. So I knew about all the developments of Brightsight, and they knew what I was doing in the market. So for me, that was very interesting. So we grew the team. I grew the team. The team that I started here in Delft was eventually taken over by Ordina, which is a Dutch IT company, a consulting company, much bigger organization. And I merged the team into that Ordina team. By that time, we were about 50 people. So 50 people doing all sorts of security projects, project management, risk management, you name it, training, that kind of thing. The thing that consultants are doing, running big projects. I was also involved as a project manager in running big projects. And so we were happily moving along in the same country, and we now and then touched upon each other. After, I think, close to 15 years at Ordina, I was approached by Collis, and they were just acquired by UL. And I knew the manager, the owner of Collis pretty well, because in that ecosystem in the Netherlands, I came across him a number of times. We had a very good relationship, and he said, well, Ernst, why don't you come and join us and start developing the consulting team within UL, Collis/UL. And I did that. I joined them. I really liked the team. I liked the atmosphere. I liked working with Dirk-Jan van der Heuvel, who was managing director of UL then. And I stayed there for 3-4 years doing that and having real fun. But it started again. That was more or less slipping away from security. Although UL did security, that was not my thing. I was more in the team consulting, and they were more focused on functional and helping teams, which I liked, but it was not my passion.
But you were there when they started the transaction security department. They bought up all the PCI labs. And
yeah, they bought the PCI labs, but I was not directly involved. Of course, I knew the labs. I knew Hugues Thibault, who was running the lab in the UK, the security lab.
RFI.
RFI, yes, I knew them. I touched with them. We spoke the same language, but I had a different role in the company.
Yeah.
I had a different role in the company. And so although we were colleagues and we were in very good relationship and very good terms, it was not my role in the company to have a go at that. And honestly speaking, I missed security. I really missed the security part, because functional is interesting and it's fun, but for me it was a bit boring. I was missing my connections to the industry. I was missing the discussion with the teams, and at that point in time, I started looking around again. And interestingly enough, that this is when, in one of these many coffees I had with the Brightsight team, specifically Jan Pieters, because we were colleagues from way back, and we always kept in touch. And at one of the coffee times, he said, "Ernst, I'm thinking of stepping down. Are you interested in rejoining Brightsight?" And that for me was a gift. That was really for a gift. I was having a great time at college, or /UL. I was having a great time, but I was missing something. Jan Pieters coming back and he said, it took me at least 5 minutes, well, a bit longer than that, but it took me a weekend to consider this his question, and then I said, yes, let's see if we can make this work, and that went really smooth. Oh. So I think 2 months later, I was in Brightsight, and
but in the beginning, we didn't know what you were doing there, because it was never announced this guy will be the CEO. Was that already kind of decided, or is just to look at it first and then we'll see?
No, Jan Pieters, he had, of course, the idea when we had these discussions and when I joined the company, the idea was to replace him. That sounds, well, at least to take over his seat after he retired, and he gave himself a year to do that transition. And in that year, he gave me the freedom to start to learn the company, because you think you understand the company, even if you were at the foundation of the company and you know what we're doing. And I knew a lot of people that were still there, they were still around. Still, you don't really understand the company. And he gave me the time to do that. And but basically, when I rejoined Brightsight, I got 2 assignments. First assignment is make sure that we are getting more professional, less T&O vibe, more commercial vibe, and we can dive into that a bit later. And secondly, at some point in time, we need to sell off Brightsight, because Jan Pieters and Dirk-Jan, they were the majority owners of the company, and they needed to sell off this company at some point in time. And so start preparing for that and see if we can do that. So those were my 2 assignments when I joined the company. And this is where I happily started.
If we see that 2 assignments alone, you did really good job. So as you can see, I'm more dressed up than before, than the previous interview. And that was, still remember when you became directly my boss and you said, "Kai, you are in the management, start wearing shirt." So to honor that, I'm wearing shirt today. But I think that fits into what you said about making an organization more professional. So when you came into the company, you were looking and you were observing. What did you see? What was the points that you think needed to change?
I think the most important point that I saw and I addressed almost immediately is putting your customer central. There was still this attitude that we are the security lab, and I'm exaggerating a bit, of course, but for the story, but it showed we are the security lab. They will come to us. Our marketing department, we don't have marketing. Our sales department, we don't have sales. Customers will just call us, and then we will see if we have the time to serve them. And I said, well, that's not right. That is not how you should treat it. Even if there's scarcity, even if customers are piling up because there's a lot of work and there are not so many labs to serve them, still treat your customer respectfully. Treat them as a customer.
Yeah.
And I had some bitter examples there, like a customer that was, okay, can you please fill in this questionnaire because this is what I need from my organization. And bluntly we said, no, we don't do this. We don't fill in questionnaires. If you want us to work for you, you just send us an order and we do the work, but we're not filling out questionnaires. And I'm exaggerating a bit. I'm making it a bit black and white. But that attitude, I thought that's wrong. That is wrong. Even if there's scarcity, there will be a time when customers, you will need your customers. And by the way, you always need your customers, but you need them even more. So that attitude, that is change. That is a change. Second attitude, I think, is what is your role as a security evaluation lab?
Yeah.
Your role is not to hack products. That's not the role. Your role is to see if a product fulfills the requirements. And if the requirements are there, they are clear, and the product fulfills the requirements, you have done your work. It's not like, I'm only happy if I broke the product, if I found a weakness in the product beyond the requirements. That is not our role. That is not the role. Then it becomes a sort of hobbyism. I want to be smarter than the developers. You don't have to be smarter than the developers. If the product fulfills the requirements, they have done the work. And if you don't like the requirements, talk to the schemes. Yeah. But that attitude, that really attitude.
Yeah. It was a bit blur at that time. Different roles, of course. I don't think it's per se we are so cocky that we don't want to serve. But it's one part. I think it's, speaking as a Dutch person, it's a bit Dutch. It's a bit. I remember when we were having 4 times workshop on common criteria and PCI in Brightsight. We had 3-day workshop, and then the last day it stops at 1:00 in the afternoon. And and then they let everyone go. I said, it's 1:00. Why don't we just organize a lunch so people can talk and mingle, and then we can have more fun, and people don't have to be hungry. But they were not mean to not do that, but they never thought of that. No. I said, no, you just go and just eat lunch yourself. Yeah. I think that's more of a Dutch style of thinking, but I think it's also something that keeps on changing on the service level that we offer to the customer.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a natural cultural thing, but it was at least a company cultural thing. The company culture was not like, let's treat our customers nicely. Yeah.
They were not very commercial.
No. And it's not being rude, or it's not that they didn't like it. As you say, they never thought of this. Yeah. So I think that is really something that we needed to change. So what I did do, I started appointing people. I say, okay, now you are a commercial person, like yourself. And we had other examples in that company. And I vividly remember the look on your face. Me, commercial, I have no idea how that works. Well, you are commercial, because you are the one already thinking about, let's organize lunch for a customer if they are here. That is putting your customer, at least giving them the proper attention and build a relationship with that.
Also, we went to China together. You saw me interacting with the customer, and that's also one thing I think I owe my career on that, because you came back and you tell Jan Pieters, this guy is a commercial, he's doing all these things, talking to the CEOs, and we should have that kind of dedicated people, because I was working 10% on commercial stuff at that time, and mainly I was an evaluator. Yeah.
No, but the culture, because in a company with that culture, commercial is a dirty word. Like you're selling something and you're forcing customers into something that they don't really want, and everyone has this, not everyone, but in the lab there was this negative atmosphere about selling a service to a customer. And what I learned in the consulting industry, that is what you do all the time. You're selling a service to a customer, and that's not that you're forcing a customer to buy something. But if I go to a shop and buy a bread, the person in the shop sells me the bread and I buy the bread. That is a normal commercial transaction. I'm interested in buying the bread, and the commercial person at the bakery is interested in selling the bread to me. And I go to the bakery that has the best offer and the best service and are treating me nice. And that attitude was not in the lab.
But funny enough, we were already, I think, the most commercial lab in Europe that I know. Because the German lab and the French lab, not to attack them, but at that time what I got the feedback from Asian customer is that they are even a bit worse.
Yeah, I would not dare to comment on that. And I'm not.
I can.
You can. Yeah, but at that point in time, think about yourself. What can we change? And of course, I'm not saying. In hindsight, everything looks simple, and I said, well, we've done this and we've done that. At that time, it was a struggle. It was a bit of a struggle because the attitude in the lab was a bit different. Like, okay, should we do this, etc. Now, all of a sudden, people like yourself are now fully commercial. We are working and he is spending the money. That kind of attitude is there, so you have to break that, You have to at least explain what you're doing and why you're doing it and why it's successful. If it's successful, it starts explaining itself. So I think you're a pretty good example for that, because with your efforts in China, Chinese customers started coming to us. We are better than the commercial, and that is exactly the same story as the baker. I go to the bakery, which has the best bread and the nicest people selling it to me. And that is for security labs as well. And of course, you need to have the accreditations, the qualifications,
That
etc.
time we were also lucky on two parts for the China market. One is that I speak Chinese and can explain things more clearly. And the second thing is that we had the CERTIT as the Norwegian scheme that accepts Chinese CC evaluation requests and do certification. I think that I will try to talk to CERTIT in some time. But I think that's two very important aspects why Brightsight were successful in providing the service to China.
Yeah, you could say that we were lucky at some points, and is luck something that comes over you, or you work on that? But I think it's a bit of both. We were lucky to be in the Netherlands and to be more or less independent of the big industries and governments with strong opinions, like the French government and the German governments on Chinese products. The Dutch government was more pragmatic, and we didn't have an industry behind us. So yeah, we were lucky in that sense. But even if the opportunity is there, you still have to do it. You still have to go there. And the example that you gave, obviously you're a Chinese speaking person, but how difficult would it have been for the other labs to hire a Chinese speaking person? Well, apparently quite difficult.
Not me.
Well, apparently quite difficult, because it took a very, very, very long time before we saw other labs taking on that path as well. So we were, and then we were already miles ahead with them. So this is how we grew the market in China, which was extremely important for the development of Brightsight. I think that putting your customers first, being more commercial, being more commercially driven, having a dedicated team to talk to customers, business development, sales, whatever you want to call this, having a dedicated team for that, I think we were really new in the market. And if you look at the teams, the companies we're competing with, they all have now commercial teams, but they were much, much, much later in that game. And even I think today the Brightsight commercial team is strong and big and showing that. Although other labs are picking up very, very nicely on that. So but I think that's a sign of a developing and maturing industry in that sense. So that commercial part, so that is, I think, something that that I changed. The other part is, what is your role as a security lab? What is your role in the market? I think that also helps. And but that has a big effect on what's happening in the lab. And I underestimated that because basically what I said to evaluators, and I didn't say it myself, it went through the management and etc., but into the project leaders, I said, well, we have to organize our projects better. We need to have dedicated project leaders who are focusing on running the projects as they were quoted. That is extremely important to do that. And you don't do more, you don't do less. That's what because that is the contract that you sign with the customer.
Yeah.
And I give the example all the time. It's like if you have a constructor working in your house, you want him or her to do what you ordered. Not more, not less.
No.
Because more will cost you more, less you've paid too much. So you have a contract, honor the contract. It sounds very trivial, but that is not the way this industry works.
No.
Because how the industry works is you got a contract and then the evaluator started playing around with that and say, I can do this, I can do that, I can break this, I can find a vulnerability there, perhaps I can exploit it. And they completely forget, again, too black and white that statement, but they forget what is the requirement and why are we doing this. And the role of the lab is not to think about the requirements, because that is the role of the schemes. So they say, well, this is the level of security that the product will have to provide, together with what the customer will say, okay, this is the level I am providing. That is the foundation of the work, because the check of the lab is just, is it within these two boundaries? Not more, not less. That is a completely shift of attitude in the lab. So, and it starts really at the beginning already. If you get into a product, how do you look at it? What are the vulnerabilities that you see? How do you look at the code? How do you look at the design? How do you do that? And more importantly, how do you translate it into work that is carried out in the lab to verify the results, to verify the analysis that there are no weaknesses? Because the other point there is, if you get a product to evaluate, you will have to assume that the developer did the proper job. You will have to assume that the product is in line with the requirements. You are verifying if it's there. It's not like here's a product, see if you can break it. Mm-hmm. No, it's like, here's a product. I, the developer, think it fulfills the requirements. Otherwise, I wouldn't give it to you. You will have to verify that it does fulfill the requirements.
Yeah.
And if you do, perfect, then you've done everyone happy, evaluator happy, developer happy, scheme happy. If you find a vulnerability, you think it's correct, or you think it's safe or secure, but during my analysis or my test, I found a vulnerability, and I'm sorry, but the requirements are that there shouldn't be a vulnerability, then we have a problem.
Yeah.
Then we have a problem, because then the developer will have to start thinking, oh, do I change it? Do I, what are my actions? It's back to the developer.
Yeah.
So that attitude, that change, and I'm doing it in a couple of sentences right now, that really took quite some time, and we're still not there. I think as an industry, we are still not there.
No, but it's. I think most of the people, they don't understand how flexible security evaluation is. And I think there are different approach. From our observation, we have, I think this more like continental approach. The European approach on security is more flexible than what America is doing, because of they have a single bigger market. They have to make sure that they don't get sued by a developer, and they have to provide a very predictable evaluation scope and time and money for that. But Europe, it was more flexible in the sense that we look at the product, and then we define the product, and then we look at what needs to be tested, create a test plan. So every product, depending on the scope and the type, will have a different approach on that. And like you said in the beginning, I think the generation all started as kind of white hat hackers. They were hacker from origin, and I remember we always say we want people with hacker mentality. And I think the first split, like when Mark Witteman left TNO, was also he wanted to pursue a more tools-based and hacker mentality thing instead of doing certain scope of evaluation. But when you came in, I think you also saw we're still sometimes trying to do too much. or get caught up in the fun of hacking. And I think there's no black and white in there. There's a lot of room in there. So I think it's an adjusting of that level where we look at and what is really important. I think Brightsight was also doing, although not perfect, I think it's never perfect, but we are also trying to do that for the customer and argue with the scheme or the certification body. We think this is enough or this is not enough to support our customer to convince the certification body to get their certificate.
For me, the important thing is that as a security lab, you're offering a commercial service, and the customer is paying for that. And you're absolutely right that the requirements by itself and the schemes by itself require some sort of flexibility and innovative approaches from the lab and some freedom there, because it's not black and white. It's not like testing the acidity of milk, where you have a standard protocol, you have calibrated machines, and you have a trained engineer or a laboratory person to run the test, and the outcome is pretty clear. It is not like that. This is not what security is all about. It's like, because you have to dive a bit into the mind of a hacker, because hackers are not bound by rules. No. So it would be very easy if you just say, well, you cannot break this product because you're not allowed to, and that would make the defense. It is not like that. That is not what security is all about. On the other hand, the flexibility that you mentioned and the flexible approach, that can also be extremely difficult for the developer. Because you hand in the product and you will just have to wait and hope and pray that you don't have a very creative security evaluator that, above and beyond the requirements, he or she finds a vulnerability in your product, and all of a sudden you have a problem, although it may not even be required to solve that. Yeah. So that balance needs to be that's a very delicate and fragile balance. And the schemes do not always work as well. They don't always help you there. The schemes come up with requirements and they say, we have to do it like this, you have to test it like this. So they're bringing up this level. And that's the right of the schemes. They are doing the risk analysis on behalf of their customers, the users of the product. So that layer between there of the schemes, that is helpful for the customer, helpful for the lab. But I think not only we are changing as a security lab, the security lab is not changing, also the schemes are changing, also the customers are changing. We are entering in a way more professional world. And I think you acknowledge that if you look at the industry today and you compare it to even 5 years or 10 years ago, it's completely different. It's way more professional on all aspects, way more commercially driven, at least more, okay, what am I spending? What am I getting from this? And is it worth what we are doing?
Yeah, but some might argue from the old generation might argue it's less fun. It's it's less spontaneity, less this fun in hacking. But I think, like you said, it's a process to become more professional as an industry. And of course, to a lab, we have more competitors. It's more difficult to keep the customer, but that's just part of life. If you don't go through that, or like TIC companies buying all this security lab, then it will never reach the normal people with their day-to-day commercial devices to get security and be evaluated and certified to be used in the household. Because we were always looking at high assurance, and it's the smart card, it's the ID, and the big telecom devices. But nowadays it has to move to a different maturity to service all the worldwide or all the normal consumers.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. I think the industry that we are coming from and the industry that is well matured is the high assurance. And some may argue that we are completely over the top with the requirements and the tests and what we are doing there to make sure that a smart card device or any other high assurance device is secure. That is not the role of the lab. Again, that is not the role of the lab to determine. That is the role of the scheme, and the scheme is doing that on behalf of the end user. So that is, but we are extremely advanced. If you look at today's capabilities of a security lab on what they can do on smart card technology, and we're talking about the 10 million traces for power analysis. I'm talking about multiple lasers, whatever, combining everything and breaking a device. This is what a lab can do these days. And if you look at the scientific papers coming out there, there's plenty of other stuff that you can still do, because a smart card or a high assurance device is just a product. It has to work, and it can fail from a security perspective. How much effort you have to put in there, that is for the schemes to determine, okay, is that still good enough for my purpose, or do I need something more? So, but that is working. The balance there is working, at least as far as I can see it, as from the perspective of just one pillar of that system.
But you said you were a bit underestimated. It's because you didn't expect the team to react in a certain way.
True, because you any manager can tell you, if you want to change the DNA of a company or the behavior of a company, that is, you think you can do it on Friday afternoon, but it will take you a long time to do that. First of all, because as a manager, as a changer, you think that you see the world very clear. This is how we do it, and now I am right, and we can do that. And honestly speaking, that's not always the case. It's now and then you are oversimplifying things, and in reality, things are more difficult. As a security lab, I could say, now we do this, now we do that, but that means, if that means that the schemes are unhappy, you may be right, but still you lose your accreditation. So that you have to take that into account, because the attitude in the schemes will have to change at the same time. Also, the behavior of the people in the lab, they are not stupid. They are very talented, very bright people. They do things for a reason, and oversimplifying things is not always the right thing to do. So what I was trying to do is at least get an open discussion with everyone, and at least, do the change gradually. And some things were helping, so we're doing that. So if you look at a company like Brightsight, but I'm sure that happened with all the other security labs out there as well. Project management is way more professional now, as it were a couple of years ago. Running a project, making sure that you're on time, you're within budget, you execute what you're supposed to do, have normal contact with your customers. It's way more professional than it was before. That is a change as well. If you look at 10 years ago, project management
working on a
keep
small...
the customer happy. Well, it's part of it, but it's more than that, because you still have to honor the contracts.
So at that time, I think we were still working from an Excel file on the project.
Well, tools, people are focusing very much on tools, but the tool is just a tool. It's the mentality. What is the most important thing if you run a project? Is it just to keep the customer happy? That is just one element of the project. You have to keep the organization, in this case the lab, also happy, because the customer has to pay, but you also, as a lab, you have to make some money out of that. So the balance needs to be there, and if you just put all the focus on the customer, then you neglect the focus of the lab. So the balance needs to be there, and I think that is the professionalism that we see now.
Yeah. But it's just about management itself. I think we all experience when you try to manage, you cannot take care of all the detail of everyone. Sometimes you have people misinterpret, or they just go very extreme in a certain direction, while we always say, use your common sense in deciding or making decisions. Some people will say, no, I'm just focusing on this, and this is my KPI, or this is what I want to reach, and just ignore the bigger picture, which is difficult to control, but it really happens. I think we both have people like that in our team before. I think that's the most difficult part when managing any company, not just Brightsight or things, but something that you have to learn. And I I think there's probably no solution. Management book is every year there's a different style, and sometimes you have to do this hands-on, sometimes you have to give distance, and I think that's just a very, very difficult part.
Yeah. No, but I think the problem is that for me, to make it a bit more generic on that part, every manager, and that is just my thesis here, every manager became a manager because he wanted to control things. He wants to control things because he wants, okay, this is what I want, this is how I do it, this is what I manage. I make sure that what I want is executed by the team. And so a manager is at least coming from a control background. What I also see is that if you're a good manager, you will have to let your teams work. Not yourself, because you bring everything to yourself. So you have to step back from that control.
Yeah.
So that is the fight that I think all managers have. How much do I control? How much do I leave it to the team? And that was the same at Brightsight. If you take some giant steps, Brightsight was just a lab in Delft with 50 people, 55 people when I joined. Today, if you look at Brightsight, 10 locations worldwide, couple of 300 people.
More, I think. 10 or
okay.
11 or so.
You see, things are moving rapidly. But the illusion of controlling that is just an illusion. You cannot control everything. You will have to rely on strong local management, strong local project managers, some local engineers, local evaluators, local lead evaluators. You will have to rely on that because the span of control is just too big.
Yeah.
And this is where most managers are struggling. So you see two kinds of managers, I think, on the extremes. One say, oh, I leave everything and I have no idea what's happening, but I'm just managing the business and I'm surprised by the surprises. Or you have the micromanagers that want to be on top of everything.
Yeah.
And well, both extremes are obviously never the right, so you have to be somewhere in the middle. Yeah. How did I handle this? First of all, I traveled a lot to all the labs, talking to the managers, not telling them what to do, but just listening what they needed from me. And so giving them at least the feeling, and more than the feeling, but also giving them the tools and that they should control their own business, because I cannot do that for them, and I'm not supposed to do that. This is what they are, and I trust them fully in doing that. But on the other hand, if something went wrong, if you had a project that's going sour, or you have to take a managerial decision, you have to zoom in and be there on top. And that balance, that is the difficult part, I think, in general on that. But if you bring it back to the lab, that also means that you will have to give a lot of confidence to the project managers. And that's interesting, because we had a lot of discussion. I think the biggest discussions, or the longest discussion, with project managers, because what we did at Brightsight is that we started making requirements, procedures for managing projects. You mentioned, no, stop using the Excel tool. We are now using this tool, and we're using it for all project managers. So at least we have the same tools. We speak the same language. Project managers felt like, now you're controlling me. And well, I was trying to explain, no, I'm not controlling you. I'm giving you the freedom to run your project yourself, giving you the freedom, but at least if something happens, someone can help you, someone can take over you. We know what language you speak. So by doing that, I can give you more freedom. If I have to first learn how you run your project and interpret your Excel sheet, etc., you are, at least in my mind, almost forcing me to micromanage you on that part, because I will have to understand that first. So giving you the tools, giving you at least a framework where you have to work in, that gives you the freedom to work within that framework. But as a promise, I will not bother you then. If you do it like that, I will not bother you unless you call for help because a project goes sour. So that change in attitude, that took a long time.
Yeah. So I don't know about other people, but at least from my point of view, I did get a lot of freedom from you for the Asia part. But considering time, I do have 2 points I want to talk a bit on. One is the name. #1 security lab in the world. So Brightsight, we had this partnering security approval, and then we moved to intelligent game to play. It was chess pieces, and then we started with Kanye the dog as partner, and then chess pieces, intelligent game, and then we came to #1 security lab in the world. And I think that was a fun story. What I remembered was you and me, and I think DJ, we were just chatting, or you guys are chatting, and then we just suddenly it bumps up. I don't know how you remember it, and then just say, no, we just call ourselves #1. And I still remember, it's a fun story for me, because for us, it's quite, we just call us #1 and we just work to that. It's good to have a vision or have something putting in front of you and then say we are #1. And of course, in many aspects, we were #1, the biggest lab and most successful lab commercially, I would say. And then we started use that, but I still remember the resistance from the team about that. They were saying, why are you #1? Why are we #1? We are not so good at certain part. What was your memory on that?
What you see there is not a culture clash, but a clash of minds. If you look at the evaluator, we bring a product to an evaluator and they look at it, what about this, what about this? They challenge everything. If you give an evaluator a security target in which the developer describes what the security functions of his product are, the evaluator, the role of the evaluator is to start at the first sentence and start challenging the first sentence up to the last letter of the last sentence. It's there, and take things very literally and etc. That is the mindset. That is what an evaluator does. And the more nerdy the evaluator is, the more rigorous he is in that statement. Now the complete opposite is marketing. The complete opposite is marketing, and so it is, you make a statement. Is that statement 100% always true? You cannot formulate a statement like that. You cannot look at a statement like that. A payoff for a company is just what the company is representing to be, what it's wanting to be. It's an ambition, and it's also a statement of where you think you are. So the statement, the #1 security lab in the world, that was really, really, really well thought of. We had long discussions, internal discussions, and that was particularly Dirk Jan and myself working on that. And I said, well, this is where we want to be. Do you agree? Yes, yeah. Say it. Say that where you want to be. I think we at that point
it until you make it.
Yeah, but it's not even faking. It's not even faking until you make it. And I think there are numerous examples of statements like that. The interesting part is that we use that statement. And internally there was like, yeah, but we are not the #1 because on this and this aspect that competition is better than we are, and whatever. You can think about take it very literal. If you say I am the #1 lab in the world, I have to be best on everything, and I have to have the best coffee in the house, and whatever, you name it. Everything has to be. That is the evaluator's point of view. Our customers really liked it.
Because they're working with the #1.
They're working with the #1 lab. They really liked it. The schemes really liked it. I remember that when we presented this and we had a lot of discussions internally, I was at the conference and one of the schemes were presenting, I don't know what they were presenting. They were presenting something and they were presenting how they were working, and they listed the labs that they were working for. And the scheme started with the statement, of course we work at Brightsight, the #1 security lab in the world. And I say, well, there you are. Yeah. There. Don't look at statements like that if it's 100% true. That is not the idea of that statement. It's not like a legal statement in a contract. It's an ambition. It's where you want to be. But I like this story because it really showed what the differences were on the level in people. Another thing that was interesting, and I see that with tech companies a lot. Interesting is that, we made this statement. We presented that. That was a marketing statement. We said we are the #1 lab, security lab in the world, and we are there. And then one of the engineers came to me, oh, we're having that discussion on, our coffee is not the best, so how can we present ourselves as the #1 lab security in the world? And I said, well, you have your job in the company. I trust you on that. You are a side channel evaluator. And what do you think if I would just walk into the lab and say, no, I think you do this wrong, I think you do that wrong, and that. What would your answer be? I said, well, I wouldn't listen to you because you are not a security evaluator. You have no idea what you're talking about. I said, right. And you are absolutely right in saying that, because don't take any hints or any suggestions on side channel from me, because I don't know how this works. I understand it, but you are the expert. Why do you think management is also a job? Management is also a job. Trust your managers. Trust your managers. And of course, you can always challenge them. I will challenge the people in the lab if I say, well, are you doing the correct thing? But I will listen to the answer. Please give us also some credit from the managerial perspective. Don't fight us, but think with us. Help us. Help us where you're there. And if you have solid reasons why you think that statement doesn't work for you or for your customer, tell me. And then we can discuss it. But take both parts of the equation, take it seriously.
But I think because this, indeed, I brought up this story is also because the clash of mentality and how people think, at least our high assurance hackers thinking, in contrast with more commercial thinking, and that for me is always interesting, and also some kind of clash. Of course, we listen to each other, but at certain points, it's also a lot of doubts and things like that. It's not easy. So to manage smart people is never an easy thing, but it worked. And also a funny story: when I was in China attending a event, and the people from ANSI was there. There's the French certification body, and we were all on the podium. We have to do an introduction because it was a panel. So I just say, I'm Kaifan from Brightsight, #1 security lab in the world, and everyone starts to laugh. And people talk to me from then on also, oh, you're from Brightsight #1. And then the guy from ANSI was the next. And he said, I'm ANSI, I'm the #1 scheme in the world. So it's really funny how people, sometimes you just need to trigger people, and then they just, okay, they remember a certain slogan. That's how branding and things work. So it was fun. And the second thing is you participated in the setting up of Beijing lab, and we had an event there. What was your experience at that time, and to expand to non-Europe part? Or
Yeah, interesting, because at first the first lab we opened was the lab in Barcelona, or Sant Cugat, but let's call that Barcelona for the sake of argument. First of all, opening up a lab somewhere else was really a big step for us. Brightsight did something before I was there. There was some cooperation with Singapore and etc. But that was not really doing that to that extreme. So what our ambition was in Barcelona, we found some very, very talented people, very ambitious people as a group, and we more or less integrated them into the Brightsight family, and we gave them the keys to a building and say, okay, have fun and build your own lab here. That was really very interesting discussion, and very interesting learning curve, very steep learning curve, because the same reason applied. My idea was, I have very bright people, very talented people originating from a different lab. I have people here from a competing lab at Brightsight. So how much can you learn from your competition? I think a lot. I think really but there was a lot of hostility, too strong a word, but there was a lot of confusion. Let me rephrase
resistance somehow.
Resistance, but they do nothing. They do things differently, and etc. I said, well, I had to really, really convince the people here and say, well, they are not idiots. They may have done things differently, because this is how it goes, They developed a way of working, you developed a way of working. The attitude is not to look at each other and say, you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it better. It's not a competition. You're now one team. So learn from each other. Yeah. Learn, perhaps they did things better than you did, and likewise, so help each other in growing. And well, that took quite some time. So that was very, very interesting in doing that. So that was the first very steep learning curve on that. And I think in the end it worked out. It worked out very, very well. It took a bit longer than I hoped for, but now if you look at the Barcelona lab and the Delft lab, they really, really work together and really trust and learn from each other how to do that. On China, that was a completely different story. Because first of all, it's far, far away, and I'm not saying that Catalan culture and Delft culture is exactly the same, but the bridge to cross to Chinese culture, that is a much bigger gap. For me, we started very, very small in Barcelona. It was just a location, and we just wanted to have a location in China. Why?
In Beijing, you mean?
In Beijing, yeah, in Beijing. Yeah, in Beijing.
All started with B, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. In Beijing. So in Beijing, it was just a location. It was just a location where you were there, and sometimes a person flew in, and the only reason we did it was to have Brightsight China. Why? To show our Chinese customers we take you seriously. We are moving to you. We can help you. We are close to you. We understand you. We do that. So that was was it commercial successful? If you look at the lab in isolation, no, it was a money pit. We threw money in there. Was it commercial? Overall successful, I would say very, very much, because we already had a very strong relationship with Chinese customers, and they saw the effort. We had a celebration, an opening party, not in the lab because that was too small. We had a very nice location, and I think about 200 people were there in that room, and everyone was really welcoming us to China and show, okay, you are interested. And bear in mind, China was isolated from the technology perspective, and we were making the move to them. Small step, but really very, very significant. And if you look today, Brightsight has a couple of labs now in China.
Three.
A Plus has a lab, Risker has a lab. All the other labs are moving there way, way later. But I think we made a very significant step there towards the Chinese market and Chinese developers. So I'm very proud of what we did there. It was a bold move. Because if you just look at the numbers, as I said in the beginning, the direct costs are very clear. This is what it's costing me, and it's costing me a lot. The benefits are way more vague, because then you start thinking, well, would the customers have come to me? Would they have shown that loyalty if I didn't make that move? Again, it's not pure mathematics. No. It's not science. I think overall, what you could see, I think it was pretty bold move. We made very, very strong relation, built very strong relationship with the most important Chinese customers out there. And today, the relationship is still very, very strong.
Well, that's what I like about what the Netherlands as a small country, and also Brightsight, what we try to bring the security to not just Europe, because you're not living in vacuum. You're depending on products from everywhere in the world. Of course, there are some thinking about high assurance for national security reason. That's a different topic, but still you want the world to be better in security, to pay attention to the stuff we work, which is also now even further, like I said, not only geographical, but also down to the basic device level. Yeah, so that's very interesting.
No, and I agree with you on that. And so but the change from a Delft company to a, well,
global.
Opening, to Barcelona, calling it a European company, that is too broad. But at least having multiple locations, and then taking the bold move to China, I think that was very, for me, that was very interesting. And why did we do this? Because we had lengthy discussions with Dirk Jan on this. So when the two of us were sitting in our room and drinking coffee, everyone was thinking we were just catching up what was happening over the weekend. But we had a lot of strategic discussions on this. Say, what do you think? What do you do here, etc. Because, as I said, the costs are direct. You can see the cost directly, but the benefits come later. Why did we do it? Two reasons. First of all, showing the customers that you care. Showing that you care. Now, yeah, of course, they can always come to the Netherlands, and they continue to do that, or to Barcelona, whatever. Making the effort, going to the customer, and as a side effect, if you have a Chinese entity, you're an expert on that. It also eases up doing business with you. We didn't realize that in the beginning; that was never there, but small things really piled up there, and so from a commercial perspective, that was another bonus that we got there. But I think the most important was that we showed the customers that we care. And this is also the reason that we expanded after that. So we moved to France, and so we were building close to where we saw customers there, where we saw customers. We wanted to be present. Another thing that we did, and that is, I think, very typical for at least for Brightsight at that point. And at that point in time, we had people from different nationalities in our team. We had about 30 nationalities here in Brightsight. So if you were if you were a Chinese customer, of course we can offer you a Chinese project manager. If you're a French customer, of course we have French-speaking people. Spanish, Catalan, no problem. We have it. So we have people that speak the language, and that was also very, very efficient in helping the customers there. And that is again, are you lucky? We are the Netherlands. That means that we are multicultural anyway. We have students from all over the world, attracting them. But if you have a strong Chinese foundation in your team already, people coming here to study, they enter your network easily. So we had a constant inflow of people from China, from the technical university. We could almost handpick the youngest and brightest people there. So that really helped us in building up the lab, but also building up the relationship with the customer. The second path is, as I said, I was hired to do two things: make Brightsight more commercial and more professional. I think this is all part of that. So we grew the business, and I think, as I said, when I started, it was about 55 people. At that point, where we are right now, when we opened up Barcelona, when we opened up Beijing, we were over 100, and I think 125 already. So, but the second part of my mission in Brightsight was to prepare it to sell off to a company. And we already knew or analyzed that, well, who would buy us? For which companies are we interesting to add to their portfolio? And we figured out quite easily that would be the big tech companies, the big tech names, the testing, inspection, and certification company, because during the professionalism, not only the lab, but also the schemes and the customers were more and more professionalizing, meaning you are moving, at least, you're not there, but you're moving towards what the tech industry is already accustomed to. Give me a product, I will test it, and I will certify it. So that is a move in the market that we already saw happening, slowly, but steadily. And we saw in the end, we would end up at a tech company. So a tech company, and then you look at the big names like Bureau Veritas and Intertek and SGS and you name it. So the big ones. Our feeling was that one of these companies, one of these big names, that would be the interesting party for us to be sold to. And so we were preparing that. And one of the things that we noticed for those companies, all these companies were global. If you are a very local company, you may not be so interesting for a tech company. So the more global you are, the more global you can offer your services, the better it is. And you don't have to have all these satellites there. You don't have to have it, but at least you have to show that you can do it and you think globally. So also in that part on, prepare ourselves to be acquired. this is also a very important move to broaden the footprint, expand the footprint of Brightsight.
Yeah.
And we continued doing that. We continued looking at opportunities. I also mentioned the lab then in France. We looked at other locations.
There's market and also talent, so it's no-brainer.
It's clear that you. Of course, if you grow, you cannot just grow for the sake of growing. You need to have you have need people to run the lab. So and as I said, if you want to work locally with local customers, it doesn't make sense to put a French evaluator in the lab in Beijing because he doesn't speak the language. It makes sense if you have a person that at least speaks the language or is local to that. So it all goes hand in hand, but always from a strategic point of view, the two things were there. How to make the lab more professional, more commercially, and that is not that we want it, but that is how the market is developing. So be sure that you are there when you develop the market, and then prepare yourself to get yourself acquired.
Yeah, I think because I aim this podcast to talk about more before COVID things, so not going into detail in the acquisition part, but I must say having a lab in Beijing did help a lot when we were trying to bring up the capability of SGS in security in the region. So I think that's very important aspect for a TIC company to consider. So with that, I really want to thank you for today's time. So do you want to share what you are doing now or plug something that people can still find you, or are you just enjoying your retirement? Or
No, I wouldn't call it retirement yet. One thing that one anecdote that because I just mentioned it briefly, that my path was to do the acquisition, and we're still pre-COVID. The good thing is, and of course, if you're looking at things in hindsight, you'll always see the positive things. At least I see a clear path that I walked, and when I was on the path, I think I could have stumbled here and there and lost the track of the path. But in the end, we succeeded. I think in the end we succeeded with the two missions. I think if you look today, that Brightsight is a way more professional lab than it was years and years and years ago. And not only us, I think we also changed the industry, because when we changed, the industry followed, or we followed the industry. It's a bit of chicken and egg, but the entire industry changed. The developers changed. The schemes are more professional. I think the entire industry is way more professional today. Another trend that we saw was happening, and we didn't fully notice, but at least our strategy was focused on that, is that the big tech companies take a very important role today in security evaluations. Major labs are part of a TIC these days. So
all of them?
Not all of them. There are still some small French villages that are resisting the Romans. No, that's kidding. But no, there are still some labs out there. But the major TICs, the big, so the Intertex and the A plus and the BVs and of course SGS and the TIFs, they all have now their role, and that is because the schemes have changed. With the CRA, the role of the TICs is way more important. Certification bodies is way more important. So this is also why I think it's important that security labs now also have at least the capabilities to have a certification body with them. Of course, completely separated, everything there, but at least under the same broader umbrella. So that is so we were right on that strategy, and we were also right on, in the end, a TIC company would acquire Brightsight. And coming back to the number one security lab in the world, it goes without saying that the big TICs like to have the big security labs. So the biggest TIC in the world, SGS, acquired in the end Brightsight. So I think in the end, mission completed from that perspective. That was all prior to COVID. Brightsight was acquired during COVID, and that is the most crazy thing that happened in my career. That we did the entire sale of Brightsight through Teams.
Yeah.
I only met the teams in SGS, I think 2 or 3 months after the signature was done. And even the signature was done through Teams by a notary somewhere. I have no idea where. Well, somewhere in the Netherlands. And I still vividly remember there that we were sitting at a screen. The team of SGS was sitting at the screen. And there was a notary and an assistant notary and said, now I sign on behalf of Brightsight. Now we sign on behalf of SGS. Deal done. Congratulations. End call. And then we were there. That was the crazy COVID time. We sold the company successfully, and we could only celebrate amongst ourselves. The buyer was not there, the notary wasn't there, the legal support was not there. We were just in a small meeting room like this and said, yeah, what just happened? We just sold the company. After that, sell. I promised to stay at least 3 years to make sure that the transition or the migration of Brightsight into SGS was done in a proper way. I will not go really into detail on that, but I think that was pretty successful. Brightsight is still there, flourishing, growing, and doing all the right thing. Senior management is still in place. The person who's now running the team, Xavi Villarubla, was already with us during the process. I hired him, and from almost like day one, I said, like Jan Pieters, hired me and said, one day this seat will be yours, and he is still here today. So what am I doing? I have stepped back. I will not call it retired. I'm still a bit too young for that. 64 years old, and I still feel much younger, but I'm enjoying life. I am enjoying my life. I'm doing consulting a bit. I advise companies in the industry on the broader terms, and giving, at least sharing my knowledge and my experience. And I would prefer to call it experience, not knowledge, because, well, what do you know? But I at least have the experience of success and failure, and sharing that is valuable. So
people can still find you on LinkedIn, and
they can still find me on LinkedIn, and I'm not very outgoing when it comes to that, because I think in the end it's after 40 years of a productive life, it's also good to enjoy a bit of the quieter things of life. But I still have knowledge, I still have experience, so I'm happy to share that.
Yeah, with that, I think it's a good closure to that. I think for about the last part, selling and become more professional, a lot of people I'll interview probably will have different view from different layers, but I think it's a good discussion. And also, I do agree, if you just look at the two targets you're setting, that went really successful. So wish you a lot of luck, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I cannot believe I forgot it again, but at the end of the show, I'm supposed to ask everyone, who do you recommend me to interview for the podcast? So, Ernst.
Yeah, the first name that pops up is Wouter Slegers from Trusted
Trusted
Bee. He's been in the entire industry. He has seen everyone everywhere, and he's an extremely knowledgeable person. And I'm sure he can give you a very nice, you can interview him very nicely.
Okay. Wouter, I'm coming for you.